Hi, everyone. This is Chris Barnes from East Brunswick Public Library with another episode of Read, Watch, Listen. This is a podcast where we connect with people in our community to ask what they've been reading, watching, and listening, and how you can too. Our special guest, she wears a lot of hats in the community. She is currently the principal of Irwin Elementary School here in East Brunswick. She is also the president of the East Brunswick Public Library Board of Trustees. Joann Chmielowicz, thank you for being on our show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Great. So you worked in East Brunswick for a long time in the school system. Were you a school media specialist at one
I
point?
I was at almost all the levels. I've taught everybody pretty much from K to 12 as a media specialist and then moved on to become a school administrator.
Yes. And so you've done that. You're also on our library board of trustees. So thank you for all your support and helping us.
Well, the library is one of my favorite places in East Brunswick.
Now, is it true that you worked here at one point?
I did many moons ago, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and I got my library degree. I did my internship in the youth services portion of the library and was a page.
So you know where all the cool stuff in the building is.
Yes.
You clearly like reading and literacy and all the fun stuff that libraries have. So on Read, Watch, Listen, I'm going to ask you about what you've been enjoying and how our customers can get to it. Our first question is, Joann, what have you read recently that you liked?
So I have three categories that I predominantly read in. I love mystery books of all sorts. I'm currently reading, I guess you would call it historical mystery. It's called Her Royal Spyness, is the name of the series by Rhys. And I love those because they're funny and they all take place like around World War II. They don't require a whole lot of brain power in order to read them. Like they're just nice, light reading. I also will always go by the cookbook section when I'm at the library because I love to cook and bake and do all that kind of stuff. So I'm always over there looking for new ideas. And I love because the library has such a big selection of cookbooks that you can kind of experiment with recipes from that section. And then, but if you don't like that book, you can always get another one. And then I always get books from the travel section because my family and I like to travel. And although the internet is a wonderful place, I do like to have a travel guide right in my hands. So that's what I'm reading right now.
No, it makes sense to do as much prep work, especially if you're traveling somewhere new or different or outside of the country or even other parts of the country too. Because I find myself in this weird Northeastern bias about everything. And you're like,
Ye-
what do you mean they don't do this in Oklahoma?
Yeah, I also like to see what the writer thinks are like the best places to eat or something like that,
Mm.
versus like a Yelp review from the internet where, you only get the people who are salty about the fact that their bacon was overcooked. So I like to have a little bit more of an unbiased opinion about that sort of stuff.
Is your role as the principal of an elementary school, what is something that you would recommend to a third grader who does not like reading?
I would say that if you're a third grader and you don't like reading, it's because you haven't found the right book yet. Because there is a book for everybody out there. And sometimes it requires you to kind of find a book, which is maybe not your first choice because maybe it doesn't have like a cool looking cover, but maybe the content inside of it is going to be more appealing to you. So, for example, I had a student who told me he didn't like to read, and he didn't like to read fiction was the issue, but he
Mm.
really loved to read nonfiction, and he was particularly interested in dogs. And so when we found books that kind of played towards his strengths and were accessible to him as a reader, and also gave him an opportunity to read things which I think broadened an interest that he already had, he became one.
That's really cool. As somebody who doesn't read fiction, this hypothetical kid that we just talked about is somebody who I would have been friends
Yeah,
with that
yeah,
you
yeah.
mentioned.
Well, it's really funny because my husband is an avid reader and he never reads fiction.
Mhm.
And I am an avid reader and I predominantly read fiction. So there's room for everybody. And that's what makes the library awesome, is because it's got everything you could possibly want in it.
No, it's a great place. You can literally find something on everything. So switching gears here, what have you watched recently that you would like to recommend to someone?
I am like a serial watcher of things, meaning if I find something I like I love baking competition shows like the Great British Bake Off or the stuff that's on like Discovery Network or Food Network. I love watching all of that kind of stuff. But I'm also a humongous fan of anything that was made in Britain. So I love like British mysteries and British serial dramas and things like Downton Abbey and stuff like that. So those are for sure things that I'll always be having on my rotation of things to watch. And I'm the kind of person who can watch the same show like 9 times and I'm not bored with it. Sort of what I like about it is the familiarity of watching something I know I'll enjoy.
But I also think there comes to be like a greater appreciation, especially like a show like Downton Abbey, where things slowly build over the course of a series that you pick up on, like, oh, that's what they were mentioning in season 6.
Yeah, well, you invest in the characters, right?
Yeah.
It's the same as with a book. So when you watch something, especially something that's multi-episodic, you just get this investment in their life and you become super interested in what's going to happen next. And that's one of the beauties of watching something that has either multiple seasons or like now with Downton Abbey's perfect example, it was a TV show and now there's all these movies and that stuff's awesome.
Again, you'll have to forgive me. I'm not up on all night Downton Abbey, but from just the scuttlebutt around our coworkers here in the library, the last Downton Abbey movie was polarizing. Either people really loved it or they did not. Which side of the fence did you find yourself on?
Oh, it was for sure like a five hanky movie. Okay. So like you have so it's one of those things where like I'm not a big spoiler kind of person, right? I nobody
Mhm.
likes that whole idea, but when you emotionally invest in characters and you watch a series which takes place over time, obviously things happen, especially in historical drama, things happen which change in the characters' lives. And if everybody always had a happy ending, how boring would that be? So, and I always think of that as kind of like a therapeutic cry. It's like a no harm, no foul, because that person's really still roaming around on the earth, right? Like they're just their
Right.
character. So I actually like that sort of stuff. So I'm definitely still team Downton for sure.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. And our last question is, what have you been listening to? So this again could be music, it could be a podcast.
If you checked my circulation statistics, one of the library's biggest audiobook listeners,
Mhm.
I use the Libby and the Hoopla apps religiously. They're on the front screen of my phone. And if I have headphones in, I am probably listening to an audiobook. Again, because I'm a big mystery fan, I have been reading a series of mysteries books that take place in a tea shop in Charleston, South Carolina. And South Carolina is a place I like a lot. So that one's super interesting to me. But I'm also a very avid podcast listener. I love lots of the different NPR podcasts like Freakonomics Radio and Tell Me Another. But I also love celebrity podcasts like Rob Lowe does one called Literally, based on his, it's kind of a play on his character from Parks and Recreation.
Mhm.
And I love that one. And Alec Baldwin does a really great podcast that I listen to often.
Very cool. Have you read Alec Baldwin's last book?
I've not read any of his books.
It's very interesting the way he writes. It's just kind of like he's sitting there with you, and he's just catching up and saying, "So this is what's happened the last year and a half of my life." And
Yeah,
yeah,
well, you can see that in his podcast, right? Because he has
mhm,
an interview style with his guests where you can see that he's been interviewed enough time in his life that he wants to make that person feel comfortable. So I can imagine that it's that same idea when he writes to people that he wants to bring them in. I mean, because it's a very vulnerable thing to write about yourself. So
right. Yeah. I went to a book signing with him once, and he was very polite. He was very friendly to everyone, but I don't think the man blinked for an hour and a half.
yeah, I would imagine that people who spend their life in the spotlight have like a mode that they get into, like where they can just kind of like grind it out when they're doing press events and stuff.
Yeah, he was extremely friendly, very polite, but just so passively intense. And I was like, wow. I like this is why you are a media superstar.
For sure. Sure.
I have one last question for you. As the president of our board of trustees here at East Brunswick Public Library, what is one thing that you wish more people in the community knew about our library?
Well, I think that people have an antiquated idea of what the library is. And they think it's only a place that you can take out books. And I think that the library, particularly the East Brunswick Public Library, is so much more than that. besides the fact that you have access to a wonderful digital collection and a wonderful online collection, and most people don't know that you can borrow books from all around the county through the LMXAC app or through the library catalog. I think that they also don't know that we can get your passport. You can go to the makerspace. There's a space dedicated to teens. There's lots of programming for kids. I think that they forget that it's also a place that the community offers things for you. And, sometimes people will say like, oh, there's nothing to do around here for my kids if they don't play sports. And my first reaction to them all the time is, are you checking out the library? Because there is so much for your kid to engage in there. And I think that that's a really important thing to realize, is that the library is like a resource for all the different parts of your life. We teach English language learners how to become more proficient in English. We help people learn new skills. And librarians are seekers of knowledge. So if you want to know about it, they want a program for it.
That sounds good to me. I couldn't have said it better. Joann, again, thank you so much for taking some time out to be a guest on our podcast today. You can listen to our full archive of East Brunswick Public Library podcasts at www.ebpl.org. This episode of Read, Watch, Listen, as always, is produced by Melissa Hosick. For East Brunswick Public Library, I'm Chris Barnes. Thanks for listening, and see you at the library.